Welcome back. This is Fiscal Policy, Part 3, thinking about the national debt, its size, and different budget philosophies. So here's our debt level as of July 2016. And if you want to look at the up-to-date, simply Google U.S. National Debt Clock. So do economists generally think that deficits are a good thing ever? Or are they always necessarily a bad thing? And what about surpluses? So a question for you would be, when the unemployment rate rises, what do you think happens to GDP? If you're thinking that GDP probably falls as unemployment rate rises because people are out of a job and so they're producing less stuff, you'd be right. The follow-up question then is, what happens to the budget deficit when unemployment goes high? If the government is trying to stabilize the economy, and that's what fiscal policy is all about, using government spending and taxes to stabilize what's going on in the otherwise unstable private sector, what do you expect to happen to the budget deficit during times of recession? So when unemployment rate rises, we're probably, that's associated with recession. And during a recession, when overall spending is lower, we would expect the government, if it's doing its job, to step in and to stabilize, to increase its own spending to make up for the lost consumer and business spending happening. To prop up the economy, then we'd expect budget deficits to do just as they're doing here, rising when unemployment rate rises during recessions. During war as well, we run deficits for obvious reasons. So here's a practice question for you. When does the deficit rise? Answer is both A and C. So on to the question about, are deficits always a bad thing? Are they ever a good thing? There's some different philosophies about the budget, quite frankly, and there's no unified response from economists, although economists generally are not going to support this annually balanced budget idea. So there are some on the right and a lot of non-economists that like the idea of an annually balanced budget. It matches with how we think we should be living our personal lives, and so we apply that to the government, especially when we think about politicians, and if we believe they're corrupt and they're sort of wasting money, it can be sort of a check on that. However, if you were to balance your budget annually, the government would never be allowed to run a deficit. It would never really be able to stabilize the economy. In fact, what you'd find is in an annually balanced budget situation, when the economy hits a recession, incomes will fall, and so tax revenues will fall. And what government will have to do to make up for that balance is to cut its own spending. So you don't want the government, if the underlying economy is unstable, you want a government to be able to go against that. You don't want the government to be having to cut its own spending during a recession. That's only going to make the recession worse. So we want counter-cyclical, not pro-cyclical government help. There's another school of thought, and this is the one that John Maynard Keynes, the sort of inventor of macroeconomic policy, believed in, and that is you can worry about balancing the budget, but not every single year. Rather, think about balancing it on average. During good years, you don't need to stimulate the economy, and so your tax revenues, you can raise taxes and cut back on spending, right? That's the right thing to do, so that you have some savings, some government surplus for when the economy hits a recession. You can dig into that rainy day fund and put that money into helping the recession. So you can cut taxes at that point and raise spending. However, as you're probably considering, that doesn't seem to be the thing that's happening. Our politicians don't really go there. Politicians in general, if they're democratically elected are going to want to be popular, and the popular policies with people are not tax increases and spending cuts, but rather the reverse. And so what you're finding is that politicians over the long run tend to always want to create deficit spending. And then beyond the economic costs, there's always social costs of debt. So we saw in Greece recently that Greece ran such a high level of debt that lenders were worried that Greece wouldn't be able to pay back. And when that happens, the lenders don't want to lend to Greece anymore. So Greece, if it wants to keep its government running, it's going to need to keep borrowing some money. And so it's going to need to start paying higher and higher interest rates, sweeten the pot, so to speak, for lenders. So high risk loans tend to have higher interest rates. Greece looked like a higher and higher risk. And so it ended up spending a lot more of its current revenue paying on interest. To try to fix the situation, Greece launched, with Germany's insistence, launched into something called austerity, that is massive budget cuts and tax increases to try to get its budget back under control. But notice that Europe really was already in a recession. This ended up causing even more social strain as cuts happened right in the middle of a recession. And you get such strain sometimes, you get fringe political groups gain power. So we saw neo-Nazi groups on the rise, still on the rise in Europe. And finally, don't forget there's a difference between deficit and debt, right? Deficit is the yearly overspending, and debt is the accumulation of all past deficits that have not yet been repaid. And here's how we compare globally to other wealthy nations. So that the debt as a percent of GDP for Greece was very high, 175%. For the US, it's about 80%. There's many above us and many below us. And Norway here has a lot of oil wealth. It has invested, and so they run some surpluses. Looking forward, we know that the US population is aging, like many other wealthy nations. And this is going to put some strain on the budget as our implicit liabilities, those things we have promised to pay, like Social Security and Medicare, become more and more expensive as more of the population retires. So that's going to be something that the U.S. will have to grapple with going forward.